All right, good afternoon, everyone. I think I know most people here, but I'm Joanna Cohn. I'm the director of the Institute for Global Tobacco Control here at the School of Public Health. And I'm delighted to introduce our speaker today at our Innovations in Tobacco Control lecture series, and that's Dr. Jim Thrasher. He's an associate professor at the University of South Carolina and also a visiting professor at the Mexico National Institute for Public Health. And he's the PI for the Mexico arm of the ITC study, the International Tobacco Control Policy Study. Dr. Thrasher has training in anthropology, behavioral sciences, and communications, which puts him in a very good spot to study the things that he does, which are the effects of the media and policy on smoking-related behaviors and perceptions. He does a lot of cross-country work on health warning labels, both experimental and observational studies. He's just recently been the scientific chair of the Latin American Conference on Tobacco or Health that was held in Costa Rica just a couple weeks ago. He's also co-chair of the Society for Research on Nicotine and Tobacco's global network. You can tell he's an all-around amazing person because he's won awards for both research and teaching excellence. So that's great. And so today he's going to talk to us about the cigarette pack and the impact of warning labels. So thank you for being here.
Thank you all. And thank you, Joanna, for inviting me here today. Yeah, I'm just going to jump right into this. I'd like to talk about the cigarette package, using the cigarette package for health communications, with a particular focus on warning labels, although we have quite a bit of other research going on around the world that focuses on the package and the impact that the package itself has on consumer perceptions and behaviors. But in general, what I'll be talking about is why it is that health warning labels on why use health warning labels on cigarette packaging. What are the characteristics of pictorial health warnings? One of the things that we often don't appreciate is the complexity of information that's presented on warnings. So I'll talk a little bit about that. I'll also describe some of the work that we've been doing to determine the most effective content for health warning labels. Countries are increasingly in this position of trying to determine which content they should include in order to have the biggest bang for their buck. And that includes the U.S., which remains to implement a new warning label policy. And then thinking about health warning labels as part of a broader kind of communication system or communication environment is something that I also want to emphasize by the end here. It doesn't just stop and start with the warning label. It's how that can be linked to other messaging that's going on in the environment, both favorable towards tobacco use and tobacco control discourse and interventions. And then finally, I'll talk a little bit about some areas that I think of as being particularly productive for future research, so that we can kind of get on the same page with regard to what I see as priorities. You know, those of us who do work on tobacco packaging and labeling recognize that the cigarette package is really a mini billboard, and the tobacco industry has known this for a long period of time. Here I have some pictures of people in Mexico City who are smoking and laying their cigarette pack out on the table. And that communicates information to the people around them and essentially makes the pack into advertising. The industry has recognized the importance of the pack as an advertising tool for many, many years. This is just some evidence of that from Philip Morris, their document saying that our final communication vehicle with our smoker is the pack itself. In the absence of any other marketing messages, our packaging is the sole communicator of our brand essence. And increasingly around the world, tobacco advertising, promotions, and sponsorship restrictions have shut down the other channels that the tobacco industry can use to communicate with its consumers. And so the pack has increasingly become the vehicle through which brand essence and marketing information is communicated to consumers and potential consumers. Part of that involves how it is that packs are displayed at point of sale. Here's an image that I took last fall in Brazil, where they had just implemented a tobacco advertising display or tobacco advertising ban at point of sale. And you can see how prominent the cigarette packages are here at point of sale. And this is not limited to Brazil. You go all around the Americas and you see these kinds of displays replacing traditional advertising. And you see the backlighting there. It really captures your attention. We saw it in Mexico when they first outlawed advertising through other media about 4 or 5 years ago, and then it's kind of reproduced itself and disseminated around the region. We know that exposure to cigarette pack displays is associated with perceived acceptability of smoking, perceived ease of access to cigarettes, and also with smoking behavior amongst youth. And then amongst adult smokers, there's also evidence that the frequency of exposure to advertising and displays at point of sale is associated with perceptions of the social acceptability of smoking. Unplanned purchases, basically cueing smokers to buy a cigarette pack when they weren't planning to buy a pack when they entered the store, as well as relapse, and that's a critical issue. It's providing cues to people who are trying to quit and promoting smoking behavior in that group. So when I think about warning labels, I try and think of them in this broader context where you have the warning label and all the characteristics around size, location, different types of content, pictorial, textual, the execution and design elements of the warning label, all that situated within the cigarette package itself. And the design, shape, and brand imagery can interfere with or potentially enhance the warning label impact. And then the pack is connected in various ways to features of the tobacco control environment. You can see the whole litany of the standard kind of tobacco control interventions that we utilize around the world to promote tobacco control. And then you have kind of the pro-tobacco messaging that's also potentially linking in with what's going on with the pack. And I also like to highlight the situation of the pack within kind of the broader product environment, where it is that cigarettes can be signaled as being different from other kinds of products that people normally consume through the types of prominent warning labels that are put on cigarette packaging. This is an illustration that probably many of you have seen, but it documents kind of the increase in the use of pictorial warning labels on cigarette packaging around the world. Canada was the country that first innovated this policy in 2001. Brazil followed suit in 2002, and then there was just kind of a slow, gradual rise, and today we're at about 63 countries around the world, still waiting for the U.S. to implement. The Framework Convention on Tobacco Control talks about how health warnings should be at least 50% of the size of the pack and displayed on the prominent surfaces of the pack, that is the front and the back. And they say may be in the form of or include pictures or pictograms, although the recent kind of implementation guidelines strongly recommend the use of pictures or pictograms to convey risk. Here's a list of the countries that have the largest warning labels around the world. Uruguay was number one starting in 2010. Australia took its place in 2012 along with the implementation of plain packaging. And today I'll be talking about 4 of the countries here that are kind of at the top of the list. And so remember that these are 4 of the countries that are kind of at the leading edge in terms of at least the size of the cigarette packaging. Just to give you a brief overview of some of the elements that can characterize health warning labels, here's an example of a pack from Brazil where you have kind of a title and you can look at kind of the font and the letters and their contrast with the background. Then, of course, there's the image, and there's lots of different ways in which you can represent risk through the image. Some countries attribute the health information to health authorities, others do not. And some countries, if they have quitline services or other cessation resources available, will use this to try and link smokers to the cessation resources that are there. Many countries around the world don't have these kinds of resources. And so one of the tensions in implementing this policy is around the extent to which we should be thinking about how we link smokers up to assistance. I'll be talking a bit about Mexico today, so just so you get somewhat of an idea what's going on with Mexico. 30% of the front of the pack is a pictorial warning that involves the image and usually some sort of slogan or statement around smoking causing the health disease that's represented in the picture. The slogan is then reinforced on the back. The back can only include text in Mexico. There's a scientific kind of elaboration of the health issue that's described. I think this is probably one of the more interesting features of the Mexican cigarette packs, where you have a box describing the toxic constituents that are found within tobacco smoke. And kind of like the Surgeon General's report from 2006, linking those toxic constituents to other noxious things that one finds in one's daily environment. And then finally, at the bottom, we have kind of a call to action and a 1-800 number if you want to find cessation information. We've been following up smokers since 2006 in Mexico, and we can see how the pack has effectively increased awareness of some of the toxic constituents in tobacco smoke. The red bars here are from before the implementation of the policy, the pictorial policy that included this box with the toxic constituent information. And there were 6 different warnings that were circulated, and these are the different elements that were mentioned, and we see kind of an increase in knowledge about this constituent amongst smokers there. And when we think about how the FDA may want to communicate with consumers about toxic constituents, packaging seems like a very reasonable strategy to reach smokers. One of the things that I also find interesting about the Mexico case is how it is that smokers who were exposed to pictorial warnings compared to those who were exposed to only text see warnings as containing more important information, see warnings as being more believable, and they even have enhanced perceptions of the government, which is something that we've been able to use in talking with regulators about how important it is to include pictorial warnings, because smokers perceive them as being more important, more believable, and in fact you can enhance your own image if you implement these things. That's not always going to be the case. We've run some experiments with smokers here in the US where we attributed warnings to the FDA, or we didn't attribute the warning to any authority. And we found that while the smokers who were liberal in orientation really didn't distinguish between these 2 different packs, smokers who were conservative in orientation said that the warning labels were less likely to motivate them to quit if the FDA's name was included as part of the message. So that's probably not too surprising, but it's something we may want to consider when we talk about who we're going to attribute the messaging to on warnings in the US. Another thing that I think is important is the extent to which smokers accept these warnings. We asked smokers in Mexico, for example, before the pictorial warnings were implemented, whether warning labels should contain more information, the same amount of information, or less information. And 98% of smokers before the implementation of pictorials were satisfied with or wanted more information. After the implementation of pictorial warnings, that number basically stayed the same. You had some people say they wanted less information, but it's really a very small segment of that smoker population. So in terms of acceptability broadly across the smoker population, I think we're doing quite well with these. Another thing that I think is important that I kind of alluded to before is the opportunity to link up smokers with cessation assistance through warning labels. These are data from Brazil where you have kind of quit line call volume, the number of calls that are placed to the 1-800 number that provides cessation assistance to people who seek it before the implementation of pictorial warnings there, and then after we see a nice increase. Some of that kind of tails off afterwards. But with the renewal of warning label content, you can get that bumped up again afterwards. And we've seen that in a couple of countries now.
Jim,
Yep.
is there not a traditional spike around January for people to try and quit?
Well, yeah, there is a spike, but I mean, that's, it's not, well, I don't know if there is in Brazil traditionally. There are in other jurisdictions and other countries, but there's no spike in January. So, the spike is out here after the warnings are getting implemented out to July. So this is an example of one of the new Canadian warnings. Canada implemented it in 2001 and then implemented its second round in 2012, July 2012. And for the first time included a website on the warning labels. And we asked Canadian smokers if they had noticed any information about cessation resources that were available online. And without saying kind of where the source was, and 15% of Canadians said, yeah, I've noticed it somewhere. And we asked, well, where did you see it? Most of how many? Oh, 15% of smokers said that they saw it on the warning label, not through a media campaign or pamphlets or through some other medium. And of those who say that they saw it, 22% of them cited the warning labels as a reason for going to a website to find more cessation information. And the people who didn't see on warning labels, only 4% of them ended up going to a website to seek out cessation information. So it appears as though the channeling people to websites is also a viable strategy, and may be actually more cost effective for people in low and middle income countries where they don't have significant resources for a 1-800-QUIT line. So another topic that often gets left out of discussions around warnings, particularly when discussing the Canada example, is the opportunity to include inserts. And this might be something that would be particularly viable in the US for a number of reasons that I'll describe later. But Canada has inserts that they stick inside of packs, or depending on the pack shape, will print on the inside of the pack. And you have 8 different messages. Most of them are kind of positively framed tips for quitting. And one of the things that has been kind of a source of contention for some people who have been against pictorial warnings is how aggressive they are, how graphic they are, how negative they are. Well, you know, most communication theory says that's okay to raise people's anxiety as long as you give people some additional information to tell them what they can do to get away from that risk. And so Canada has done a nice job of doing that with these different leaflets that are on the inside of packs. No other country in the world has done this. There's a need to explore this a little bit more, so we're trying to start to do that in some of the work that we're doing. This was kind of over the 8-month period after Canada implemented its second round of pictorial warnings along with the new inserts. We asked them how often they read the inserts inside of the cigarette packs. And about a quarter of them said that they had read them at least once in the last month. So it's not getting everybody to read them, but it's getting a quarter of people to read them. And you can see here the people who are more likely to read these. But then when you look at the people who are reading and their likelihood of trying to quit in the future, we find that the people who aren't reading them, you know, only 34% of them try to quit in the subsequent 4-month period. 49% of those who have read them once in the past month tried to quit in the subsequent period. 58% of those who read them a few times or more try to quit in the subsequent period. And when we adjust for all of these issues here about likelihood of reading inserts, we find that reading them a few times or more in the past month is associated with quitting. You know, whether that is actually through kind of enhancing self-efficacy or what, we don't really know. We're sort of trying to explore a little bit of that. Okay, so that's kind of a tour of the pack and some of the different elements of warnings. You know, with regard to content, I mentioned before that governments are struggling with this issue about what imagery and what content should we include, and that includes the U.S. There's a study with which I'm involved called the International Packaging and Labeling Study, where we're doing experiments in a variety of countries in order to determine which type of pictorial warning label content appears to be working best. And also, who are the individuals who kind of respond differently to different types of content? And, you know, are there any differences across these cultural groups or national groups? So in general, we did kind of a survey of the different kinds of visual strategies that had been used around the world. And, you know, in addition to just the plain text, there are a lot of countries that have implemented what we would call kind of more symbolic representations of risk. In a country like Uruguay, which I'll show in a little bit, they show a bomb to represent a heart attack, for example. Or bars that, or cigarettes that look like bars to represent addiction. But the symbolic approach has been used often. Kind of the imagery of human suffering or personal suffering has been used quite a bit. And then we have more graphic imagery that either shows physical harm to the outside or exterior of the body or physical harm to the inside of the body. And then not many countries have done this, but countries are starting to do this, where they include some sort of testimonial text in order to determine whether kind of attributing or providing more of a narrative explanation of risk works better than the more scientific and bland smoking causes X or Y disease. So these are the stimuli that we test, as well as the ones that are actually on packs or plan to be implemented on packs in each of these different countries. And the protocol basically involves a brief survey and then people get randomly assigned to one of 15 different health effects. And then for each health effect, they're rating in random order the different ways in which you represent risk according to a variety of criteria that we know work well for assessing kind of receptivity and responses to messaging. And then they go through a kind of task of rank ordering each of the different warnings in that particular block of warnings that have to do with a specific topic. And then they rate another topic. They don't rate all of them. They rate 2 topics. And then we put them together in some models and run the analyses. I'm going to be presenting some data that are around the Mexico and the U.S. samples. And I don't want to get into all the methodological details. The main difference is that in Mexico, we did intercept surveys in public venues and administered the survey through a computer, but there was somebody who was assisting with the administration of the survey. In the U.S. sample, it was an online sample where they were self-administering. Interestingly, across both countries, the topic that was evaluated as being kind of most effective, most motivating for people who want to quit was throat cancer. And here you can see not only was the topic the highest, but the actual image that represented the risk was the same across adults and youth in both countries. Interestingly, the topic with the lowest rating was around quitting. There wasn't a whole lot of information there, but that was a topic that was rated as being least effective in motivating people to quit. And I think we have to do a lot more work to try and figure that part out. And that's where I think more elaborated messaging, like the type that we see in Canada with the inserts, is a productive area to investigate. In general, the pictorial warnings are rated as more effective than text, and that's the case across all the countries. The graphic imagery is rated as being more effective than the imagery of kind of human suffering. And the human suffering and graphic are both rated as being more effective than the symbolic imagery. Not too surprising necessarily, but one thing I think is worth mentioning is that the imagery that combines graphic and human suffering together is the imagery that actually has the largest impact. And that's one of the reasons why you saw the imagery around throat cancer as being rated as most effective, because with throat cancer you can combine the graphic and the human suffering in a way that really resonates with people across countries. So here are the results. These are the images that had the greatest impact in Mexico, the US, and China. And it kind of illustrates the point. Graphic works. And if you can combine the graphic with some sort of human suffering image, it seems as though that also works. But what's striking about this is the consistency with which some of these images show up as being in the top 5 across these 3 very different cultural and social settings. And these are 5 images out of 100 images. We begun to do some work where we put people in scanners and kind of present them with some of these images and look at kind of neural activity in response to different types. And we find that neural activity is greatest for the graphic imagery, less so for the suffering, and the symbolic we don't see as much. So in some ways it's kind of like a biomarker of the effectiveness of the warnings, and is very consistent with the self-reports that we're also getting from folks. And one of the things that I find most compelling about this fMRI work is that we also follow people up a couple of weeks after they leave the scanner. And the people who had the most brain activity in response to the presentations of these warnings are the people who are most likely to reduce consumption. We don't have the sample size to look at actual quit behavior, but those people are the ones who are most likely to reduce consumption. And so there's some interesting kind of predictive validity to this method that could also be used to help governments pick warnings that are most likely to lead to reduced consumption. In the bigger kind of international packaging study that I mentioned before, one of the other features that we found was that testimonial information seemed to work better than the more kind of didactic or scientific information on warnings. We took that in Mexico to mean that we should really explore this in greater detail, and so we developed some packaging that actually looked exactly like the packs that are in Mexico right now, where we had the graphic image that was selected as most impactful in the first study, but then we kind of elaborated the textual image. And we had two alternatives to testimonial information. One was testimonial information talking about the impact on somebody else in your family. And then the other one was talking about the impact on oneself, on the smoker, him or herself. And then we had the kind of more didactic or scientific explanation of the risk that was represented in the picture. And we were all certain that the testimonial was going to win. The data suggested it from the prior study. Turns out it didn't really work as well as we thought it was going to. In the end, the warnings that included this more didactic text were rated as more effective amongst youth, amongst adult smokers. The one group where the testimonial did somewhat better than the didactic text was the group that had the lowest level of educational attainment. And so we're continuing to explore whether the testimonial kind of narrative strategy can work best amongst this one group, about which we're particularly concerned because of, in the US at least, smoking is already concentrated in this group. In other countries, smoking is becoming concentrated in this group. Another issue that's related to what I just described is that across all of the different studies that we've done, this greater responsiveness of people with lower educational attainment to graphic pictorial warnings has been found in a consistent manner. And not surprisingly, people who have quit intentions are also more likely to have strong responses to these kinds of imagery. And I think this is a good sign as well, is that youth in general rate the warning labels as being more effective than adults. And so, we really want to be able to influence those youth as well as influence adults. Although, as I'll mention at the end, most of the studies that have been done to date really focus on adults. We need more on youths. So some work that I did here in the US tried to focus more specifically on this issue of trying to communicate with low-income smokers and smokers with low health literacy. And we compared people's responses to packs with graphic imagery, to packs with the imagery of human suffering, to the more symbolic imagery. A lot of these were images that were considered for implementation here in the US, although the stronger ones were ones that we brought in from other countries. And we found that, as in other studies, smokers with lower health literacy had stronger responses to pictorial warnings across the board. Interestingly, the graphic imagery is what worked best both for people with low health literacy and for people with high health literacy. I don't want to get into all the details around that, but it's somewhat consistent with some observational work where we've compared smokers in Brazil and Uruguay and Mexico. In Brazil, the more graphic kind of human suffering type imagery seems to be generating a greater response amongst people with lower levels of educational attainment. And we see kind of no relationship with educational attainment with the symbolic imagery in Uruguay or the text-only warnings that were used in Mexico prior to 2010. So another issue that I think is important is, again, thinking about linkage with other media events or other communication channels. A variety of countries have tried to implement campaigns to accompany their pictorial warnings. These are just a few. We have Australia, Chile, Brazil, Uruguay, and Mexico. We've done a little bit of work evaluating a campaign that was put on the air at the same time as pictorial warnings were implemented in Mexico. And we interviewed smokers in Guadalajara, Mexico, where the campaign was aired. And we could divide them into four groups: those who had no exposure either to the pictorial warnings or to the campaign, those who were just exposed to the pictorial warnings, those who were just exposed to the campaign, or those who were exposed to both. And interestingly, and perhaps not surprisingly, we see those who are noticing warning labels often or very often that there's kind of this stepped response where those with no exposures to pictorials or campaign have lowest. Those with either exposure to pictorial or to the campaign have a step higher. And then people who are exposed to both have a step higher than that. And we see that pattern played out for reading warning labels, for warning labels causing them to think about harms a lot, and for warning labels causing them to think about quitting. So there are some real opportunities for thinking about synergy between media campaigns and warning labels that we need to continue to explore. So with regard to the warning label content, it's pretty clear with the data that we have to date that the graphic warning label imagery appears the most effective. It's consistent across different samples, different types of methods, whether the packs are presented online or whether we actually manufacture packs. In observational studies, comparing countries that have graphic imagery compared to not, it appears as though the more graphic messaging or imagery is working better. There have been a lot of concerns around the level of negative emotional arousal that these graphic images can produce. Some of the works that we've been doing to date suggest that, well, that's how this works, is it raises arousal, and that arousal is what is necessary in order to prompt behavior change. So there are fewer differences across different segments of the population, but there's stronger responses amongst youth, adults who intend to quit, and also amongst adult smokers with lower education and health literacy, which I think is really promising in terms of the broader public health impact of this kind of a strategy. And then there's this remaining issue of, well, didactic text, testimonial text. It doesn't necessarily have to be one or the other. In Canada right now, a few of the warnings include testimonial texts. A few of them include more didactic text. Maybe we need to have kind of the right mix in order to maximize impact. And as I mentioned before, health warning labels can complement or work in synergy with other kinds of initiatives that are going on. So one of the other issues that we're looking at now, particularly as we have so many countries getting on board with the implementation of this type of policy, is, how should we be changing warning labels over time? Countries increasingly have to kind of address this issue of what should we do now? We have them on the packs, now what? This is just to show you that what happens is, well, in the UK there was an increase in responses to warnings, and then over time it decreased. This is the Canada data up here. There was implementation. This pointer doesn't really work very well, but over here was when the Canada policy was implemented, and then there's just kind of a slow decline. So if you don't change the content, the effectiveness wears out over time. So we need to think about ways to maximize the effectiveness by thinking about strategies for rotation. Latin America has been really impressive in terms of the number of countries that are rotating new content on a regular basis, every year in many cases. These are the first couple of rounds in Uruguay, where you have the first two rounds being in the style of the more symbolic imagery, and then later kind of becoming more graphic. And in 2010, not just becoming more graphic, but also increasing the size to 80% of the front of the pack. Here we see our surveys of smokers over time, looking at how they're responding to warning labels, and it's kind of flat as we go from one symbolic set of warnings to another symbolic set of warnings. And then we can see that the responses kind of go back up as we increase the size of the warning and make it graphic instead of symbolic. You can see kind of what the trajectory was kind of set to be, and then the increase in effectiveness with the larger, more graphic warning. We've also looked at this with Mexico. We have our trend here for what was going on with the text-only warnings, and then the first bump up with the first round of warnings, and then the second round of warnings, which are associated with that latter, the data point to the far right. Those are the ones that were based on the experimental research that we did before, identifying the content that works best, identifying the imagery that works best, and we were able to get another bump in terms of the impact amongst smokers. So I have a study right now where we're explicitly looking at this issue of wear out and looking at how it is that different kinds of policies may do a better job at impeding wear out than others. So we have Mexico, which has the fastest rotation in the world. Every 3 to 6 months, there's new content rotated onto warnings, although it also presents issues when the decision makers decide that they don't want to base their decisions on science. And it's just kind of whatever they think would be a good idea. We can talk about that later. Canada, which has the longest period of exposure in the world and then implemented its second round, but also includes these inserts that I mentioned before. Australia, which implemented its second round, but along with plain packaging, which I imagine some of you have heard of, and then the lowly US as our control group. So we're interviewing smokers every 4 months over the course of 2 years to examine this issue of wear out. And some preliminary results here. These are about to be published. But just looking at knowledge, which is not always going to translate into behavior change, but the U.S. government seems particularly interested in knowledge, so we're focusing on knowledge a little bit. Canada introduced this concept of smoking being related to bladder cancer for the first time, and we saw an increase in recognition that smoking is associated with bladder cancer. Nothing too amazing, but important to demonstrate to decision makers because they value this notion of using warning labels to understand risk. We saw something similar for blindness in Australia, which is the blue line that's up at the top. They actually had the same image on packs before in their first round since 2006. And when we started our study, right before they implemented plain packaging, the level of recognition of blindness as being associated with smoking was at 57%. But then putting that on the pack that also had the brand imagery removed caused another bump in awareness of this being associated with smoking. And then in Canada, where they implemented like with the bladder cancer warning, for the first time, a message that linked smoking to blindness, we see this gradual creeping up in recognition of blindness being associated with smoking. Another thing that I'm really interested in exploring is how it is that warning labels kind of become part of how the buzz that's going on within social networks, and does that matter or not? Those of us who evaluate media campaigns often use people's talking to others about the campaign as an indicator of impact. And that hasn't been looked at in the warning label research to date. These are brand new data, so there's just some preliminary results. But just to remind you, Canada implements health warning labels right before we got into the field. And you can see the kind of gradual decline in talking about warning labels over this 1.5 year period of time in Canada. In Australia, where you have the implementation of plain packaging between September 2012 and January 2013, an increase in talking about warnings and then kind of a gradual decrease and then a leveling off. You know, we want to continue to explore kind of these trajectories and see whether trajectories within individuals may be indicators of their likelihood of quitting later on. Interestingly, the Mexico line, the green one on top, is high and stays high. And maybe this is due to this more regular rotation of warning label content over time. Yeah?
Is that reported discussion or is that content analysis from the social media?
This is reported discussion. This is smokers reporting that they're talking about the warning labels with others, or others are talking to them within their families and also within their friend networks. I didn't say, but we also look at how this is related to downstream quit behavior, and across all countries, talking about the warning labels predicts downstream quit behavior above and beyond the normal indicators of responses to warning labels that have been studied in the past. So this matters. And if we can use communication campaigns to generate more buzz around warnings, then we need to be able to do that. To draw your attention to what I see as being kind of an innovative strategy in Chile, they are implementing new warnings every year, and this year they decided that what they wanted to do was try and build a narrative. And so the front of this is one of their warnings where the front of the pack shows a woman who's just been diagnosed with cancer, and then the back kind of shows a graphic warning of kind of what she has in store for the biopsy. And then step 2 kind of follows her to the next stage. Step 3, this is chemotherapy, hospitalization, and then death. So there's an attempt on the behalf of Chile to build a narrative around this that could be a really interesting strategy, particularly for countries that don't have the resources to do large-scale media campaigns. There have been some focus groups done with these folks in Chile, with smokers in Chile, and the way that it's happened so far is that they don't really understand what's going on. They haven't recognized that these are different steps. So there may be a way in which this needs to be sequenced such that people really capture this notion that one step is building on the next. Or, you know, it would require more resources, thinking about other media campaigns to kind of bring some of this to life for people. So when I think about areas for future research, you know, we really need to continue to hunker down with the effects of warnings on cessation behavior. I'm also really interested in this issue of whether people who have higher or lower self-efficacy respond differently to warnings, people who have lower or higher reactance or kind of avoidance of warnings respond any differently. People who are depressed versus not depressed. We know that depression or people who smoke are more likely to be depressed than people in the general population. So there's some other subpopulations within smokers that we need to continue to explore. all the studies that we've done to date that have looked at these issues have found that these do not moderate the effects. These people who have low self-efficacy, low reactance, and who are depressed may have lower initial responses to warnings, but they're not less likely to try and quit if they respond to them. So I think there's more work that needs to be done there. I mentioned before the importance of youth responses to health warning labels. One of the things that we're wondering about is whether youth are being exposed to warning labels at point of sale, and whether some of the initiatives to reduce pack displays at point of sale are in some ways going to potentially compromise the communications that are reaching youth about the risks of smoking. Something to think about, although I doubt that's going to be how things play out. We need to figure out what's the role for positively framed quit messaging, and inserts seems to me to be a really strong potential for figuring out how we can have a complementary positive message that goes with the more fear-arousing type messages that are shown to be more effective. I mentioned before the issue of habituation and wear out. We need to figure out how we best create a sustainable intervention with these warning labels. There may be some types of warnings that are more likely to wear out quickly than others, and we're trying to work on some of those issues. Do we really need to be thinking about targeting warnings to some segments of the population and other warnings to other segments of the population? We really don't know the answers to those questions. I've talked a little bit about the biomarkers and neurological pathways of impact. There's some promise that that's a reasonable strategy, both for selecting warnings that are going to be more effective and for better understanding kind of how they work. And we need to really start looking at warning labels for other products, e-cigarettes being one of them. Hookah is another one that's really big. It depends on kind of where you are in terms of its importance, but how you put warning labels on hookah is not an easy thing. Smokeless tobacco is interesting as well. Here in the US, you would think that smokeless tobacco is more dangerous than smoked tobacco because they have larger warnings on those products. We need to be kind of making sure that the relative harm of tobacco products is reflected in the warning label system that is out there. So with that, I'll just give thanks to an array of people who have participated in some of the projects that I've described here today, and open it up to questions and comments.
Thank you for a wonderful presentation. That was very informative. I was interested in the part where you're talking about labels that show a quitting message and how they haven't really had much of an impact to quit now. But from your presentation and my own reading of the literature, it kind of seems like people aren't really playing around with that content as much. I mean, you showed how people are manipulating all these different aspects of a risk message. But I didn't really see as much about people manipulating the content of that kind of quit message. And I'm curious if you've also found that to be true and what you think maybe some potential for that might be in the future.
Yeah, no, I think it's a critical question. I mean, the data that I showed on the low responsiveness to quit messages were collected in kind of these single one-shot forced exposure studies that are not reflective of kind of real-world exposure to the messaging. And as you pointed out as well, that the message "quit now," is really short. Okay, so what do I do? How do I do it? And again, I think that what's been going on in Canada around the inserts is kind of a starting point for that discussion. I would like to know a little bit more on how they decided on those particular messages. They have a lot of the information that kind of comes out of the testing of those messages available online, so I would suggest looking at some of that. But I think right now we're just trying to see how that plays out, and I think part of my job is to remind people of the importance of that issue and to try and point to Canada and remind people, hey, this is also going on, and to the extent that we can build more evidence to show that it's a nice complement to the other strategies, I think we'll be more able to get the message out.
Just to follow up, I've been thinking about, how do you use self-efficacy as a theoretical construct for developing some kind of label message, and I just sort of wonder if there might be a way to build a message around that to try to increase people's efficacy.
Yeah, we got to recognize the limits of labeling as well. Can we really increase self-efficacy with labeling? I don't know. I'm a little more suspect. That's why I think that we need to think about ways we can link people to other kinds of information, other kinds of interventions that may be able to do a better job than kind of a static kind of print message that's on a cigarette pack. I think that's part of what is going on with linking people to quitline services. I think that's what's going on when you're linking people to websites as well. So I would probably think, well, let's think of this as a linking device and imagine other ways in which we might be able to work to promote self-efficacy. But it's an important point. I thought, as I mentioned earlier, that people with self-efficacy might have, other people have pointed out that people with low self-efficacy might have negative responses to warning labels. We don't see that to be the case so far. In fact, the warning label responses are a better predictor of downstream quit behavior than self-efficacy is in and of itself. So I think we need to continue to explore that issue. Maybe we're not measuring it right, but we need to enhance people's understanding of how to do this. But part of how they learn to do it is by trying it. Self-efficacy is one of those constructs that we imagine is changing as people get an understanding of how they failed, why they failed the last time they tried to quit. And the whole quitting process is kind of a long, drawn-out process. And self-efficacy, I imagine, probably oscillates as well over that period of time. Yeah.
Hi. Thank you for your great presentation. My name is Laura. And I was just wondering with the evidence of how effective the inserts are, do you also expect to see, or have you seen, or should we expect to see an uptick in the tobacco industry also using inserts as another piece of real estate? And that same with what you were just talking about linking and like online presence. Is that like a new frontier that we should expect to see more?
The tobacco industry is already there. They were the ones putting inserts in cigarette packs first. Right? We basically stole the idea from them.
Yeah.
Also, what's interesting about it is the fact that they had done it made it easier to argue for the use of that particular strategy because they couldn't say that they were unable to do it because they didn't have the technological capacity. So anyhow, I imagine that the industry will come back with the different strategies. There are a number of examples about how the industry is using the pack and the QR codes to link consumers to the different internet sites. We've been looking at that with some camel packs in Mexico that take you to kind of artsy, bohemian websites that aren't explicitly about tobacco, but are kind of showing how it is that the industry is interested in these kind of cutting edge type cultural movements. And we expect that is linked to promotion of tobacco. But they're becoming, more and more, less and less obvious in the way that they're promoting their product. So yeah, we do have to think about new media. We do have to think about how they're using it. They're not going to be there as often promoting their brands in the traditional ways, and we need to anticipate that, stay on top of it, monitor what's going on so that we can understand and provide a relatively meaningful response to it. We were just talking this morning about some of the issues around the internet and regulation of the internet and how it is that cultural material that appears online doesn't stop at borders. And so there's a whole kind of area around transnational tobacco advertising, promotion, and sponsorship that is really tricky to regulate. And the industry is definitely involved in trying to make sure that they're taking advantage of that opportunity. So we're trying to figure out who are the lawyers that we can talk to help us figure out what kind of regulatory strategies are even feasible.
Yeah. And my other question with that is kind of broad, but do you think that any of these places will ever be at the point where we're no longer saying 50% of the front of the pack has to be a warning label and will instead be the tobacco industry can only advertise on 50% of the front of the pack, like where it's like a reverse way of thinking about advertising and warning labels?
I'm trying to make sure that I understand your question correctly. So, I mean, the industry is already using that whatever remains as advertising, and so by default we're letting them use it how they see fit. It's not, dedicated to the warning labels. Where I see things going is more in the direction of Australia, where you're standardizing the packaging, prohibiting certain means by which the tobacco industry can use the pack to transmit information, marketing information to consumers and mislead consumers. And that involves not just the kind of textual messaging and the colors and the symbols, but it also involves standardizing the shape and size of packages. I mean, the industry is innovating radically now around different types of packaging to try and capture people's attention in new ways that aren't necessarily reflected in our common notions of information around text and pictures. So I think we just need to think about standardizing packaging, and that includes shape, size, color, information, and making sure that the warning labels are prominent.
So I'm curious if you looked at the effectiveness of the warning label whenever the warning was distorted. It wasn't presented in the way that in its true form, that the decision that was made by the law. So I'm reflecting on last year, Kate Smith and I, we had a meeting with David Hammond, and he showed us, he lined up a few packs from Canada, and it was the cancer tongue. And for different shaped packs, the tongue was presented in different ways. And so I guess in its true form, you would really see that, wow, this is something that's terrible, I don't want to smoke. But when you put it on a lipstick pack or a very wide pack, you don't really even see, the full effect that should be messaged through the image. So did you at all look at what was the effect of this warning for people when the pack is actually distorted, or the health warning is distorted?
Yeah, we have some evidence, and there's other people who've investigated this issue as well, that manipulating the shape and size of the pack can alter the effect of the warning, and that gets back to the issue of aiming for standardized shape and size, so that when we're developing our warning labels, we know the surface on which they're going to appear. And it's harder to tease out kind of the effect of that on people's perceptions and behaviors in the real world outside of an experimental context. But I think it's an important issue, and I think we're addressing it in the experimental work. We're looking to Australia to provide us with some indicators of how that changes with the plain packaging and standardized packaging. Another issue that you bring up around kind of how clear the warning label is, we've experienced this a lot in Mexico, where the ink that's used for the warnings can often be very blurry. The contrast isn't there as you would expect that it would be, and the legal framework is not there to ensure that people are using the exact color that's specified. They ship them the image, tell them which image needs to be put on there, but our lawyers are saying that what needs to happen is that you need to say exactly what each little pixel is in terms of its number on I can't remember what the color scale is.
RGB.
Whatever it is, you need to be at that level of specificity. And so, there are lots of ways that the industry's playing with this. And it's interesting when you see some of the contrast between the very bright packaging that has very vivid colors, there's no blurring whatsoever. Then when you get to the warning, you get all this blurring and kind of obscure backgrounds, and the lettering doesn't contrast with the background. So, people are playing with it. But you need to have the regulatory structure in place in order to bring those issues to courts of law. And that's what we need to rely on our lawyers and developing some of the legal frameworks that we're using for implementing warnings as well. Yeah.
Jim, I have a question about your findings around symbolic style labels. And it seems, so I think you said that the graphic images had the most impact, and then human suffering, and then symbolic. And mass media communications much better than I do. So with my limited knowledge, it seems like in tobacco control mass media campaigns, we seem to also find that, this is true, campaigns that try symbolic type themes or humor or things that aren't necessarily hard-hitting also don't seem to do well. So I guess, is that what we've been finding, and then can we even generalize that more broadly?
We have been finding, you're exactly right. So it's entirely consistent with what we know from the mass media cessation campaign literature and the campaigns that target youth prevention. So in some ways, it isn't surprising. It's reassuring that there's consistency across media, and we just need to make sure that we're taking advantage of that when we're developing these warnings.
And do you know why why don't people react to symbolic? Is it that they don't get it, or they just don't think it's serious, or?
Yeah, I don't know exactly why. I think there is something around the perceived severity. I mean, one of the things we talk about a lot with warnings in trying to advocate for their use is how smokers and people in general don't appreciate the magnitude or severity of the risks. And humor is not going to get you there. So you need to show them what it really looks like. And I've been amazed at the consistency of smokers' responses to graphic warnings after they've been exposed to them, how they want more of it. They're like, if you're going to move me, I need to have this. You know, it's not going to work if you make me laugh. I mean, you'll make me laugh and then I'll forget about it. But yeah, there's something kind of hardwired. That's why we're looking at some of these kind of neuroscientific approaches. Something hardwired in the brain about kind of a negative emotional arousal that matters for behavior change. It potentially could be counterproductive if people don't know how to quit, they're highly addicted. That's why we need to be thinking about the other piece around self-efficacy and around giving them resources if they want to quit. But as we also know, the vast majority of smokers who quit without resources, quit without meds. And so for most smokers, that little kind of negative emotional arousal could be enough to push them over the edge.
And I'll just ask one other question. So I know you're doing some work in other areas as well. Have you seen this also translate to obesity in terms of hard-hitting severity versus symbolic type messages?
Yeah, you know, I think so, but it's going to be a harder sell to get that one across. But we haven't explored it systematically. What seems to be kind of a winnable battle in the obesity world is more around providing information and more symbolic type strategies. It's going to be a while before we can move in the other direction towards kind of harder hitting, more kind of fear arousing type messaging, particularly on packaging. But that doesn't mean it's not worth exploring. I mean, you know, plain packaging was explored first in the 1990s, and it took 20 plus years for it to appear as a policy. So we need to get the data out there and then see who's going to be the country that's going to pick it up and run with it. Yeah?
I was just wondering, have you ever studied the history of smoking in ancient age, how it all started, and how preventive strategy for prevention failed?
Well, you know, tobacco is a New World cultigen. Tobacco was used ritually in the Americas, Mesoamerica, Mexico, Central America, and down into South America. And actually, it started in Central America and then kind of radiated out. And was then rapidly picked up after colonization, disseminated around the world, probably faster than any other product. But, I mean, ritually, it was used to induce hallucinations. And people even did tobacco-based enemas to get nicotine into their systems. The smoke from the tobacco that was cultivated back then was much harsher, more like cigar smoke. And so people, if they could inhale it, really would go for a ride. I mean, you can try and inhale a cigar now, and let me know how that feels. You'll be hallucinating as well. But that was part of your training as a shaman in a lot of the Central American cultures, was learning how to inhale that and to like ride that hallucinatory wave. What was big in tobacco control, as a lot of us know, is that with the introduction of bright leaf tobacco at the end of the 19th century, which is a much lighter tobacco, and the flu curing process allowed for tobacco that could be inhaled into the lungs. And it was really with that kind of product innovation that, along with kind of the mechanization of tobacco production, cigarette production in particular, that allowed for the growth of the cigarette as the way in which people ingested their nicotine. So I don't know if there are any lessons to be had from early ingestion of tobacco. I would say, you know, why not go back just to the cigar? And we could prohibit the use of flu curing and lighter tobaccos that people can inhale into their lungs. If we just had cigars, probably wouldn't have that many people addicted to cigarettes, but I wouldn't be the one to want to recommend that strategy. But that might be the lesson that would be had from looking back in time.
I think enemas would be harm reduction.
Enemas could be harm reduction. Non-combustible tobacco. Yeah, well, maybe that'll compete with the e-cigarette. Bob?
Thank you. Thanks for making the trip to Baltimore. This is really interesting stuff. I'm curious about the corrective statements and how effective you think that they might be, and the different messages and the different subpopulations, and also whether the fMRI stuff was really interesting. Has anybody done that with those statements?
First of all, we've tested the smokers' responses to the corrective statements. I don't know if everybody knows what the corrective statements are, but because of litigation against the tobacco industry by the government, the tobacco industry is being obligated to disseminate statements around how they lied around 5 different themes: light cigarettes, the design of cigarettes, the addictiveness of cigarettes, that secondhand smoke causes disease, and that smoking itself causes a disease. So the industry is presumably obligated to disseminate information about these 5 topics, and one of the ways in which they're supposed to do so is through inserts, package inserts, but also through newspaper ads and TV ads and radio ads. Unfortunately, the industry has used its standard strategy of holding up the dissemination through litigation, and so we're still waiting for the statements to be disseminated. It's hard to know how people are going to respond because we don't know how well the industry is going to disseminate them. Are they going to have high-quality executions that are going to produce a strong impact? Probably not. So one of the loopholes in the law is how the industry is not obligated to disseminate these in a particular way, or potentially have somebody else be in charge of disseminating them. The law requires the industry to disseminate them. So we know they're going to be working hard to minimize the impact. But we do know what the actual text is going to say for each of those different areas, and we've tested how smokers respond to that text. And smokers say, a lot of them say that they're unaware of tobacco industry lying and deceit in each of these different areas, and suggest that they would be more willing to quit smoking if they knew this to be the case. What people say and what they do is different. One of the more interesting things that we found in looking at the corrective statements was that smokers from minority groups were the ones who were most likely to say that this was new information and that it would motivate them to quit. So, we'll see whether that plays out, hopefully. Then your second point around fMRI work. I don't know of any fMRI work around how people respond to those types of messages. A lot of the fMRI work with which I'm most familiar involves imagery. We don't know what kind of imagery is going to be accompanying those statements. We know what the text is going to be. So when I'm learning from my brain imaging colleagues is that when you engage people in reading tasks, it automatically lights up certain centers of the brain, and so that can be kind of confounded with the impact of the message. And so those textual type stimuli that you get exposed to people to in a scanner may be harder to kind of understand their impact than a text accompanied by image or showing somebody an ad that has imagery in it. I may or may not have answered your question.
So maybe one last question.
We had a question actually from somebody who's not here, somebody who sent in an email and asked, and it's kind of related a little bit to the fighting against the tobacco industry hydra, that if you have a lot of the countries that are further along in the tobacco epidemic saying that the number of smokers that they have has dropped drastically, and yet the companies still, their bottom line hasn't really suffered, kind of like, why is that happening? Is that something that you're looking at? Is it just because they're going to other countries? Like, how are you able to fight? What can we do? Or is this something that we should be looking at with the labels? I know it's a big question.
Yeah, it's an enormous question. I mean, yeah, we got to keep on fighting. I mean, we got to try and anticipate what it is that the industry is doing. A lot of people are talking about the importance of international trade agreements as being kind of the new source for tobacco control advocacy. And so increasingly we recognize the tobacco industry is using these agreements and fostering these agreements as a way of trying to anticipate some of the challenges that they're going to face in tobacco control regulations. And the Trans-Pacific Partnership is one of those areas where there are a lot of people who are concerned about how the language of that particular agreement, which involves, I think, 10 different countries, a couple from South America, the US, and others from the Pacific Rim. And in general language, if tobacco is included in kind of the basket of other products that are included in that agreement, it will weaken existing tobacco control regulations and allow the industry a kind of a legal platform for presenting challenges to future regulatory initiatives. So we need to be focusing on those partnerships because, you know, part of the reason why the tobacco industry is effective is because it is transnational. So it can seek out places where it's going to have the least resistance. So we need to be thinking about how we embed health and tobacco into these these transnational trade agreements to anticipate some of the things that they're also trying to anticipate. I mean, I think the other thing, I just came back from Costa Rica where we were celebrating some of the advances in tobacco control. I mean, if you look back 10 years to what was going on in the Americas in general, man, there was almost nothing going on in Latin America. And now, if you look at these maps of the different policies that have been adopted and implemented and are having an impact, it's a huge change. So we need to kind of commend ourselves for the advances while also kind of recognizing that there are new issues like that we need to take on.
Great. And I guess one of the issues too, even though our policies are having an impact, we have population growth in countries, so even though prevalence is percentages are decreasing, there are more people. So companies are still able to sell their products. That's one of the problems.
Yeah.
So thank you so much, Jim, for a great lecture, pulling together some of your program of research. It was really informative, and thank you for coming.
Thank you all.